Join the Toronto Holocaust Museum and its partners for a community-wide Yom HaShoah commemoration on Sunday, May 5th. A moving evening of film, candlelighting, music, and a tribute to survivors we've recently lost. Keynote speaker Yoni Berus from Yad Vashem will reflect on Holocaust remembrance post-October 7th. The program is at Beth Emeth Synagogue at 7 p.m. Register at torontoholocaustmuseum.org.
This is Bonjour Chai, the Notes on Encampment edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltzbovi. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we are discussing the pro-Palestinian protests and the tent cities that have sprung up across North American campuses over the past couple of weeks. We talked to a Montreal reporter, Justin Ling, who actually went down to Columbia University to hear what it was like over there. All this and more coming right up. Phoebe, we missed a week. How are you doing the past couple of weeks?
All right. So you've been busy, I assume, with, what was it, Easter? Is
Easter,
that it?
yes, he is risen.
Greek Orthodox
My next door
Easter.
neighbor has a sign that says he is risen. I wanted to have one that said he is not, with the flat individual, but I'm a nice guy. I don't do these things.
Okay. So, no, what have you been up to, Avi? Do tell.
Passover. It's really, if I'm hoarse, it's all the leading services, meals that we hosted, and everything. It's been a nonstop whirlwind of being offline and eating matzah and drinking wine. I feel like we shouldn't have dry January. We should have dry ER, which is the month after Passover. But that's for other people to think about. But yeah, we have so much to talk about today. We have Justin Ling coming on very shortly. But before we have him on, can you just maybe give us the rundown, give us the 90-second update for the other people who have been completely offline for the past week or so?
I was the Shabbos Goy, despite being Jewish, for our podcast, staying online at all times. I exaggerate slightly, but a little more online than you. So I have been following the campus protest stories at Columbia University, which, important background note, is located in a very Jewish area of New York City, right next to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Some students and some non-students got involved in protesting against the war in Gaza they put these tents up on a quad at Columbia University, and this is, I guess, technically not allowed. And then there was a lot of tension over this. The same style of protest started appearing at a bunch of other universities, other elite universities, other less elite universities, some in Canada, some in France. It's sort of spread around, basically with demands that these universities divest from Israel in different capacities, some more extensive than others. And what happened at Brown, for example, a different Ivy League school, was the protesters got, I guess, one of their demands, which was they're in talks of some sort of divestment there. Columbia took a different tack, and the NYPD, yada, yada, yada. Look at the Google NYPD Columbia, and you will see footage and photographs of, the whatever riot police going in to break things up there. It has spread to McGill University, as I understand it, and UBC. I do not know. I should take the streetcar and go look to see if there's anything at the University of Toronto. But it has definitely reached Canada, yes.
And they really have been hitting international attention, and we want to make sense of it all. So let's get to that conversation with Justin Ling right after we hear from our sponsor.
Are you in the market for a new watch or a special piece of jewelry? Are you looking for the perfect engagement ring to pop the question? Atelier Lou has all this and more. Eric and the team at Atelier Lou can craft a piece for you, or you can select from some of the exclusive designers that they offer. From a simple bangle to a statement necklace, Atelier Lou can make you or your loved ones sparkle. Located in the heart of Westmount in Montreal or online at atelierlou.com, visit Atelier Lou for your next watch or jewelry purchase. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BON18 for 10% off your next purchase. That's atelierlou.com.
As mentioned, the person that we are talking to today is somebody who actually went to Columbia, not as a student, but as a reporter, to report on this. And he has done a couple of really great pieces about it, which I would encourage you to go and read. We are here with Justin Ling, who is a journalist and a podcaster. You were at Columbia last week, and you're getting a good sense of where things are on campuses in general. And we'd like to, interrogate you deeply. No, we just want to get your take on what's been going on. So, Phoebe, why don't you get things started?
Sure. So, in that case, Justin, so what did you expect to see when you went to Columbia? This was for the line, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And what did you end up seeing when you got there?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, thanks for having me here. And I think, like a lot of people, I expected something bigger than it actually was. Or I actually talked to a lot of people since I came back, and their impression of what it was going to be is pretty similar to what I had before I arrived, which is that it was going to be big and disruptive, and it was going to take over the whole quad, and that it was going to be this massive tent city that had sort of consumed a big part of the public space at Columbia. And then I got there, and it just really wasn't that, right? Like, the initial encampment, of course, had been kind of dismantled by police within the first 2 days. It was a little bit bigger. But the encampment that I visited when I was there was a tiny corner of the quad. It took up, I think, less than a fourth of the space of kind of the outdoor kind of lawn area of Columbia. It was tucked away off to the side. It had fencing around it. It had, the tents like you've probably seen on the news. But we're talking about, when I was there, like 100, 150 students, a couple dozen tents, almost as many journalists kind of milling about trying to get interviews with the protesters at that point. And really, life on campus went on normally everywhere else. Like, I saw tons of students milling about. I saw a lot of Jewish students hanging around. I saw students wearing kippahs. I heard students speaking Hebrew hanging out nearby. Funny enough, I don't think you can actually get this from a lot of the photos and video from the scene, but there's actually an entire lawn of Israeli flags and photos. Those iconic photos of the hostages put up along kind of a wall on the quad just right next to the encampment. So it was smaller, it was less disruptive than I was expecting, and it was not quite the big thing that I kind of had read about elsewhere. And I actually spoke to some students. I actually spoke to this one Jewish student named David. He wasn't part of the protest. He was sort of sitting nearby journaling. And he said, I don't understand how this has become an international news story. He's like, every time I see Columbia University in a headline, I die a little inside. Because he said, this just does not merit the amount of freak out that we've seen everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had seen someone was posting about that, like, just the location, the mix of an Ivy League story and New York City seems like it may explain some of the level of interest. But there's something that you wrote about sort of you're separating out the sort of instances of anti-Semitism that happen at the protests sometimes and the overarching point of the protest. So there's a quote from you, there is the overarching goal that unites every protester and protest, a call for a ceasefire in Gaza. And I just want to talk about that a little bit, because I think I've seen a lot of different views on this about like whether or not these are in fact anti-war protests, because there is of course this tradition of anti-war protests like 1968. There's the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, wars where the US specifically was involved. This is not as straightforward of a situation. So what exactly would you say is the sort of common denominator that unites the protesters, anybody who looks at the protests and says, this is something I believe in? What is the stand?
Yeah, and I think it's a totally fair question, right? And I, as much as I can, I'm trying to get to the heart of what a lot of these protests and these encampments and these movements are actually about, right? And so, again, I think the one thing that does unite them is a belief that they want the war to end. And, we can talk about the people in that movement that believe truly offensive and radical and anti-Semitic and problematic things. But I think it is the one thing that ties everything together. And if you look at the demands that have been made at Columbia and McGill and many other universities, or the demands that are being made by these big protests that have gone through cities, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, elsewhere. The consistent thing is, ceasefire deal, stop the war, stop the ground invasion, and in some cases, we want our university. They're saying we want our universities to divest. And that's it's a little nebulous in some cases, right? I think when you hear them talk about it, sometimes they're saying, I want my university to divest from any company that is part of the Israeli defense industry. But then sometimes you also hear them kind of go broader and kind of say any company that does business in Israel. And you've also heard demands to cut ties even with, post-secondary education institutions in Israel. So some of the demands certainly go further, but the one consistent thing I think that cuts across is this demand for a ceasefire. Now, you can drill in and you can look at individual groups. You can look at individual protesters who have been caught on camera. You can look at individual leaders who will say things that kind of go far outside that ambit, right? You have heard calls for, the establishment of sort of a unitary Palestinian state.
You have heard this once or twice. Yes, this is true.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a pretty...
Yeah. Like, I don't mean it down. Like, I'm saying absolutely. And you've heard groups, organizers for some of these rallies who have said, who call the acts of October 7th legitimate resistance, right? Like, you can absolutely, I never want to downplay this, you can absolutely point to statements that are offensive, that are, the justification of violence, the justification of terrorism. You have seen people chanting, pro-Hamas slogans, like, absolutely. But I think, when we try and drill down on this, and I'm not telling anyone how to feel about these protests.
I want to move away from the feelings part as much as possible, because obviously any protest movement is going to be some sort of umbrella, and feelings fall all over the place. But I guess what I'm just trying to figure out is what you see. Like, if you're a Jew who thinks Israel has gone overboard with this war, but who does not want Israel to stop existing, would you be involved in these protests? And I'm thinking both in this sort of abstract sense, but also about a specific post I saw from a UBC postdoc, Itai Bavli, who posted, I have not vetted this with anybody, I am just reading these tweets. He said that he tried to enter the encampment basically because he agrees with the protesting, introducing himself as a Canadian-Israeli peace activist, and was not allowed in. And I'm quoting him now, he wrote, the moment I said I believe Israel has the right to exist, they told me I was not allowed to enter. I said that I'm disappointed because I believe in peace. It breaks my heart. I teach at UBC. Okay, so how fringe would you think that is? Like, obviously this is one instance one person had. Do you think that if you are somebody who's Jewish, who believes the state of Israel has a right to exist in some capacity, who also thinks this war is bonkers and needs to stop, would these protests be for you?
All I can tell you is that I met some Jews like that, right? Like at Columbia, I spoke to a number of Jewish students who are part of the encampment, who told me, point blank, God, I want the hostages to come home. I want the war to end. I believe Israel has a right to exist. I believe anti-Semitism is a genuine problem, and I think people in this movement have been guilty of it. But I also believe that this encampment, they told me, I've never experienced any of this anti-Semitism. I've never seen any of it. I support this encampment. I think we're here for the right reasons. So it's tough. Like you mentioned before, in any movement, there's going to be a lot of divergent views, a lot of wingnuts, a lot of cross purposes, and it's tough in a movement as messy as this to try and universalize any experiences. But all I can tell you is that I spoke to Jewish students who said exactly that. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in this messiness because I feel like so much of this argument that this is anti-Semitism or there's rabid anti-Semitism, or even on the other side, if you're calling me an anti-Semite, well, I might as well become one, right, is because it's messy and nobody has really dealt with this messiness up until now. And it's been to the greatest success, I think, of what's happened since October 7th is the messy middle of people that are saying, I'm a Zionist, but this is complicated and I don't want this. Or I'm anti-Zionist, but that doesn't mean that I want from the river to the sea, or whatever it might be. And now all of a sudden, as soon as something happens that is pro-Palestinian, it must be anti-Zionist, it must be anti-Semitic, because that's what it's been up until now.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And let's just talk about this in generalities, right? Like any protest movement like this, especially one that provokes such high emotions, or you're talking not just about conflict, but about a war that has become as deadly as this one, and about terrorism that was as deadly as October 7th, right? Like you're going to provoke really strong emotions, and you're going to feed into people who feel like their rhetoric has to rise to the occasion, right? Like I'm writing a book right now about the history of crowd control and riot policing, right? So you go back to 1968, and I know we like to romanticize them, but you have protesters who waved the Viet Cong flag and chanted ho, 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 Ho Chi Minh. They said, kill the cops, kill the pigs, right? Like you had people who were encouraging bombing, and you had some who eventually did go on and do acts of terrorism in the name of, anti-Vietnam War activism or civil rights activism. So the reality is movements like these become messy, right? Like a just and noble goal, like ending war, can oftentimes rationalize abhorrent behavior and disgusting rhetoric and even actual violence. And it's tough to untangle that. Like, how do you kind of talk about the nobility of a movement that is so ensconced in doing and saying terrible things? Like, that's really tough.
It's fascinating because to me, one of the most recent analogs is Russia and Ukraine. And while there are many, many movements to make sure that Russia or Russians are sanctioned, the amount of articles about how messy it is for some Russian who doesn't necessarily support Putin, and the understanding globally has become that this is not about Russians, and not all Russians support this, and we shouldn't necessarily sanction all Russians because of a messy handful of people or a messy large amount of people, because it's a very large country. And that hasn't happened yet with Israel and Palestine, right? Yeah. The Palestinian side has not ever taken real pains, to a large extent, to go and say, we understand that it's messy. We don't want, we are very careful to say that some Zionists are with us, some Zionists are not. Whatever you're going to go, however you're going to add to that or whatever that is. Yeah.
I think there are those who are saying that and who are trying to do that. But I mean, this is the nature of our information age. I mean, it's always been the case that, the moderate, thoughtful voices who are trying to, put on good disclaimers and trying to build dialogue, sometimes they get drowned out by the more radical voices. But the reality of our current age is that clips of somebody chanting a horrible and anti-Semitic thing go far more viral than a clip of someone trying to bridge that divide. And that's true for the other side as well. I mean, you sit and listen to some of these pro-Palestinian, like I follow a lot of different accounts just for journalism purposes, and you follow some of these pro-Palestinian accounts, and they find the most abhorrent clips of people on the other side saying disgusting things as well, and use that to sort of further entrench themselves and convince themselves that every Jew and every supporter of Israel is a warmonger and a terrible person, right? And it's just so easy to radicalize yourself now, and that makes that conversation all the more difficult.
I don't remember whose blog post it was, or maybe it was yours. There were so many of them where you see this pro-Zionist or pro-Israel group of people as part of the sign, and one of them has a sign that says, true demonstrations, true protest is silent, is peaceful. No, we're not calling for violence. We're not killing anybody over here on the Zionist side. And I'm like, I don't have to be a pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist from the river to the sea person to say, yeah, there may not be violence happening in your little group over here, but what you are on the side of somebody who's killed 30,000 people. There's a lot of violence on your side.
Yeah, it's so easy to define yourself against the thing you hate the most about the other side, right? Like that is just the nature of how this is working. And it gets to some really bizarre places. Like I'm of the belief that we have instituted a bit of a moral panic about this. And not to say that anti-Semitism is a moral panic, but I think we have focused such a massive spotlight on these students that we're now searching for every single instance, and we're generalizing it to too big a degree, and Twitter is enabling this on a huge scale. And the reality is, there's also ridiculous and offensive and horrible things being said on the other side. So, like, I'll give you an example. When I was covering this counter protest that happened in New York while I was there, And I saw this truly unbelievable sign this woman was holding up, and it said, "From the river to the sea, this is the only flag you'll see." And it's a drawing of the Israeli flag. And to my mind, what goes through your head? Like, you find the chant offensive. You think it is suggesting that there should be no Israel. And you've responded to that by saying, well, there should be no Palestine. Like, people have radicalized themselves.
Well, a lot of Israelis just think that. I mean, not all, but that is a political position that certainly exists in Israel. I think this is all very interesting. So I'm coming at this not just from somebody who, is online or whatever, but also I, live in the world and see all the flyers up in my neighborhood of Toronto and all that. I guess I come at it from maybe a different perspective because I think the war needs to stop. And I also am not in a million years joining up with the protests against it, even though I don't think they should be police brutalized out of existing. Yeah. I think they have the right to say it and all of that. So for me, it does put me off the protest. I don't know what it means to be a pro-peace advocate at this time because I'm not convinced that this is an anti-war movement. I'm not sure what is, though. But I wanted to kind of change gears a little, though, because so you write that, I'm quoting you, while much of the international media is focused on allegations of anti-Semitism, the protesters themselves would rather center the discussion on the ongoing war in Gaza and the claims of war crimes and genocide, end quote. So I'm wondering to what degree the protests are keeping the war in the news as opposed to displacing a complicated and upsetting story about far-off events with a more accessible and photogenic one about North American, especially university students, and thereby sort of turning this into something about culture wars, about U.S. electoral politics, about a whole bunch of things, none of which have anything to do with the Middle East. And I feel a bit weird bringing this up because I don't think it's necessarily that the students intend this, but is that sort of what's happening? Yeah,
I think it's a really salient criticism, right? Like, and it's weird because how do you twist the knob of media coverage, right? Because like I was talking to these students, both those who were protesting and those who weren't, and the consistent thing I kept hearing was, we don't deserve this much coverage, right? Like, we don't need this much international attention. I mean, the day before I was there, Speaker of the House of Representatives Mike Johnson was there to say that the university had been taken over by radical ideologies and demanding the police be sent in, right? Like, they became pawns in a grander political game, and as best I can tell, they did not want that, right? Like, this was an on-campus dispute. I mean, their demands are of their university. They're not demanding anything grander, and I don't know that it helps anybody, whether it's Jewish students on campus or whether it's the protesters or whether it's anyone, to turn this into an international media frenzy, right? Like,
I definitely think that there are people, it's where I disagree. I think that the people who are the instigators of such movements are always looking for as large coverage as possible.
Yeah, maybe.
And there's this awareness that they know that the coverage is good for the movement in some way or another and is bringing awareness to the whole thing. I mean,
well, Afi, I would just bring that even further and say there's a reason that this is happening now in Canada, in France, and other places. It's not that this isn't restricted to one campus, because if people did look at this and say, oh, this is just a few students at some college in New York, who cares? It's not replicating itself in this way.
But I mean, this is also how all protest movements work. So I mean, I think kind of both things can be true, right? Like, they can, students at Columbia cannot want their university to be the focal point of an international media frenzy, but also students all across North America can see themselves as a part of a broader protest movement who think that they are making a difference. And like, I don't know if they're right or wrong on that. And like, this happened in 68 as well. There was an entire summer of unrest that spread out from not just Columbia, but to universities all across the U.S. And you kind of hear a lot of the same conversations happening back then. Like, do these protests actually help or hinder a conversation about ending the war, or has it become localized to the happenings of a particular university? And like, again, I don't know the answer to that. But I mean, it's a perfectly valid criticism of what they're actually doing to the conversation, because I think to some degree we have lost the plot a bit on it, and I think they're right to say that the conversation should be on what's happening in Gaza, no matter where you stand on the kind of the validity of the war.
To what extent? I mean, I know Phoebe and I have a very big disagreement on this one, but I'm kind of like, and as a former student activist, like I said, I was very involved around then. I really soured on the whole notion of students as activists. And I think that it's not necessarily what you go to school to get an education for, and it's become this outsized part of your, and I thought this as a student also, like, it's not what you go to university for. It's not useful. Is it actually the amount of times that it does good? How many times is it doing harm or just useless and devoting thousands of hours of people's lives to something that is, whatever? After seeing this stuff, after reporting it, do you think that like maybe it's time that universities don't say like, listen, we're all for free speech, but let's keep it off campus. It has nothing to do with school.
No, funny enough, I came away with the opposite conclusion. But I kind of agree with you in a sense. So listen, I mean, I think universities are a place where, youth create their political selves, right? Like, I think it should be a sandbox where you get to sort of play around and figure out where you stand and who you are and how you want to enact change in the world and how you want to exist as a citizen. Like, I think that's really important. And I think activism and protest and civil disobedience are all part of that. Where I think things get really messy and unpleasant and the stakes go too high is when the outside world kind of meddles in and tries to use students as pawns in a larger kind of political movement. And I think that is the problem. And I think, outside the current conflict, I think you can talk about a whole bunch of different political fights where that's true. And I think that's the issue, right? Like, I think students should have a level of grace and should not have the prying eyes of the whole world on them while they do it. Like, I think turning these students into international spokespeople is
okay. Can I jump in on this, please? So it's funny that you mentioned a sandbox. I'm very familiar with these. I have 2 little children. I'm often at one, literally. And I'm trying to square this with the prominence of especially grad students, some of whom are older than I am, who are, out there those are students, the earnest young things of 45 or whatever. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. I think this is always going to be a tension with talking about students. Like, I don't think that professors should be going online and complaining about their own students. This is something I've thought for years. I've written articles about this, whatever. But at the same time, I think that there's the notion that what happens on campus could stay on campus, or that students themselves even imagine that that's possible or are striving to have that happen. Like, that day is done. It's a little bit like saying, isn't it unfortunate that, pornography is no longer on a print magazine? But what I was going to say is,
when I was a student in 2000, when I was a student in 2000 and there was activism happening, we were getting international coverage. This was already 25 years ago.
But I'm saying that everything does. Like, if somebody writes a stupid article in a student paper, and goodness knows, I graduated in 2005 from the University of Chicago and wrote plenty of stupid articles in the student paper. There was no Twitter. Nope, they did not go online, or at least not in any way that they were shared. So yes, I understand wishing that this stuff didn't happen. But students today, first of all, we're not only talking about 18-year-olds, but second of all, even the 18-year-olds know that they can be speaking to a huge audience, and many of them want to be. Yeah. And I think this idea that one divides between the adult world where things are real and all of this, and the student world where this is just children learning how to be in the world. No, these are grown-ups. And I guess I've been following for years now the whole discussion of the brain only fully develops at 25 or whatever. No, I think adults are adults. And I think I think professors owe something specific to their students, whether that's don't date your students or don't mock them in an op-ed or whatever. But I think the idea that things are not fair game because it's students doing them, I'm just not so sure.
No, and that's totally fair. Maybe I'm nostalgic for a time that we're never going to get back to, and fair enough. But I think you can still sort of lament what we're doing, and I think you can still sort of ask us to pull back a bit, right? And I think this was also true for the sort of free speech crusades that we had that seemed to end abruptly when these politicians started calling for police to go on campus. But I
would say that, come on, depends. It's different people. Different people said different things on this.
No, so. I mean, Mike Johnson spent 2 months ago was bemoaning the death of free speech on campus, and last week was calling for police to go in and crack skulls. But my point is just that when we insert ourselves into campus politics and start trying to meddle with it, I think that's where things kind of cross the line, and where we this is the first time the New York City Police Department has gone on campus at Columbia since 1968, right? Like that to me screams of something that we've crossed a line somewhere.
Well, that's
right?
To me that tells me that Columbia botched this. And
also true.
Big time.
I think that's I feel like there's, in terms of the free speech issue, I think it's really important to separate out the do you agree with the protest question with the do you think the NYPD going 100%. In and because that was obviously
if there's one thing that I remember that worked well when I was a student was that constant, regular, almost daily communication with the dean's office was part of the process. And we sat in the office with multiple players in the various games. And I call them games because they're real, they have real stakes, but that was it. And it was, let's not let this get out of hand. And how do we deal with this?
If I'm making one real point through all of this, it is, actual kind of dialogue and conversation, and in some cases debate and argumentation. Like, that is where we get to a better thing. Like, that is where you de-escalate. That is where you maybe convince some of these students to abandon these like ridiculous and sometimes offensive and sometimes justification of violence positions. Like, I think there is a moderating effect that should happen with good kind of campus debate and free speech and kind of the broader political discourse. And I think we frustrate all of that when we make it a very tribal fight, and certainly when you call in the cops. So I think that is really what we ought to be kind of focusing on here. And it's not to justify really any of these protesters themselves, is just to say that I think if you're really concerned about how to fight anti-Semitism on campus, you're really trying to figure out how to frustrate extremism and radicalism on campus. You don't do it with the cops. You don't do it by escalating. You don't do it through the media. You kind of do it on a local basis and actually trying to engage with them. And I think that's kind of where you get to success.
Oh, I have 3 pieces here that I want to bring up, but I don't even know how to. There's just too many things. There's too much. I mean, one is that I think there's a way that the perception that these are anti-Semitic protests, again, like some of these things are pretty concrete, like the go back to Poland area of things. I think that has a way of actually just strengthening the Zionist case, which is not really what the protesters want, but conversely, the NYPD coming in strengthens the pro-Palestinian case.
I think that the anti-Semitism at the core of this is really overblown. I think that
I don't, and
I
we
know.
will agree to disagree.
Justin, you want to take a mediating stance on this one?
No, it's two against one, and that's just the
as a non-Jew, I feel like.
I just to me what it is that these are people that are really staunchly pro-Palestinian. It just happens to be that Israel is on the other side of this, and it's the as you said, wars are complicated. It's messy. They need a bad guy. And it just happens to be that this is the bad guy in this case. What's weird to me is that, like, when you talk about, for example, the Uyghurs, you don't talk about China as being evil, right? Although that is the upshot of it. And we don't go and talk about the evilness of Chinese people, not as nearly as much.
We talk about the evilness of the communist regime, for sure.
Very, very different than saying Chinese people are evil. And to say that Zionists are evil or
when I walk through Toronto, where you would think there'd be interest in issues to do with China. I also live right next to a huge Tibetan community. Why are all the stickers in Parkdale, for example, which is a Tibetan neighborhood, it's all about Palestine. Everything is always, all Palestinian flags are like on every lamppost in Toronto.
Yeah.
It's the only thing of any interest. And I guess what I feel as a Jew is that I just would like to be excluded from the narrative a lot of the time. I feel like it's too much. I have other things that, I have thoughts about the war. I also have thoughts about like other things. And I just wish everything weren't about Jews, and look forward to a time when it isn't. And I guess one thing that I find off-putting, and I don't even know whether this falls into the is it anti-Semitism or not question, and the side note that I want to say about that is I don't even think it's a very valuable thing to be talking about, is stuff anti-Semitism or not, because I think a lot of people at this point will look at it and say, well, maybe there is anti-Semitism, but Gaza is worse than local anti-Semitism, your feelings, North American Jews, right? I just, I would like things to just be less about Jews, and I think whether I blame Netanyahu for the amount that things are about Jews, or only Hamas, or however you want to put it, I do not like living in a world where the only thing of interest is Jews. It doesn't work out well. And I don't feel like I can do anything about it, though.
So, like I said, I've been going back and reading a lot, doing a lot of research about how we dealt with the protests and the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 60s. And there's this line, and it comes from the report around after the Chicago riots, after the Democratic National Convention. And it's a line that really stuck out to me because I thought it was really prescient. It's this New York Times journalist writing the foreword. He says, "Our young deplore the violence of the old and are tempted to use violence against them. The old deplore the ferocity of the young and are tempted to use violence to suppress them." And I actually thought that was really, and like, I think it really sums up both the kind of willingness to throw in the police, but also this feeling amongst many young people that they have to sort of keep escalating a lot of their rhetoric, and they have to make this kind of real, intensely personal, moral fight that often winds up capturing and pulling in Jews who have nothing to do with this, who have no blame to bear. And I think that's really troubling, but I think there is still a path forward to get them back from doing that. It's going to be unpleasant. I don't know that it's easy. I'm not sure it's possible, but like, that is a thing I think that should be the North Star, right? And like, maybe it's a little naive.
It's a nice idea. It's a nice idea. I think the problem is that we are at a point where fight against anti-Semitism is so right-wing coded that nobody cares. But anyway, not to be too pessimistic.
One of the things that I just haven't been able to stop thinking about is that so much of the language being used now is centered on this idea of apartheid, right? And that the apartheid movement really is guiding so much of what this pro-Palestinian, work is. And yet, if you look at what happened there, two things, come out to me is, one is that it was always about dialogue, right? The ultimate end of apartheid was about dialogue and the truth and reconciliation, and the idea that, like, let's talk it out and let's figure it out, and not let's have violent protests to make it for it to change. And then the other thing is that there was never really a call for the white Dutch, clearly colonialist people to leave. There was never this, like, go back to where you came from, leave this whole land for us. And yet those two things are completely absent from the pro-Palestinian discussion, which makes me feel a little icky and makes me say, in that sense, it's a little anti-Semitic. It is a little anti-Semitic.
Well, yes. But also, listen, I'm not going to draw a comparison between the anti-apartheid campaign and this, but again, just like drawing comparisons to 68, some of the anti-apartheid activists were radical and did actually, talk about decolonizing South Africa from the Dutch. I mean, some of that rhetoric was, and that's why reconciliation happened.
But it wasn't the overarching.
Well, but it was for a time. I mean, again, reconciliation was about trying to find a common ground between those two and try to get both sides off of their entrenched, stringent, sometimes radical positions. I mean, Nelson Mandela succeeded in part because he led the ANC away from a lot of the more radical tactics of other black liberation groups. And we don't have to go into the whole history of South Africa because I'm not even remotely well equipped to do so. I don't think the apartheid lens is actually the most useful to understand how some of the left progressives engage with this. It's decolonization. And I think decolonization is this really interesting...
So we should all just leave Algeria and go to France.
Well, no, but listen to what I'm getting at, because decolonization is this really interesting sort of ideological political framework that just, like, when you actually start applying it to real life, like, sure, it works great for talking about our relationship with indigenous peoples here. When you apply it elsewhere, it just gets to loony and crazy places. It is just it's a ridiculous political philosophy to apply kind of writ large. And, I think the more we can kind of find a better, more attractive political ideology for a lot of the left, the happier we're going to be, because I think you're right. When you get into this decolonization language, then that's what leads people to say, go back to Europe. And it's ridiculous. It's nonsensical. It's absurd.
It occurs to me, by the way, that Colombia is named after colonizer number one. And there's no talk about that.
Well, maybe they'll change the name, like with Ryerson. I mean, I'm not sure that it is the most useful way of talking about it for North America, because you get the land acknowledgement and then things proceed as normal, right? I mean, not to parrot John Kay here, but I think he's right about that. And if listeners choose to assume that means I agree with him on everything he's ever said, as I once had it back and forth with a different Canadian journalist who thought that that's what this means. Side note. But I do want to talk about something totally different, although still on our topic, which is the future of universities, of higher education, the reputation of Ivy League universities, the brand of Columbia University. Is anything going to change there? Because the reason I think about this is just there has been traditionally a lot of, Jewish interest in higher education. There were quotas so that there wouldn't be as many Jews at these schools, and so forth. Is this going to, I guess what I'm wondering is, will everything that's happening, which is no longer limited to the most elite universities, it's happening everywhere, is this going to change higher education? You have obviously the U.S. right wing hoping that higher education gets, sort of destroyed or changed dramatically or whatever. But what is going to happen here? And I ask this as a question because I don't know. There was Nate Silver's thing about go to state school, but then people have been pointing out this is happening at state schools as well. So.
Well, I mean, listen, we have I think a real primordial problem here, which is that universities are increasingly wildly unaffordable to regular people, right? Like that is kind of problem one from the outset, and the degree of financial assistance and scholarships has not kept pace, and increasingly higher education is a nice luxury. To get a full higher education is a luxury for a lot of people. So. That's starting point one, and that kind of further divides the sort of college types from the or the state school types, right? So it's step one, but step two, like I'm really skeptical of the idea that this is some sort of breaking point, as I've heard some people describe, because again, all they can kind of do is look back to history, and you see the same conversations happening after the summers of campus unrest. There was even Nixon actually ordered a commission on campus unrest that kind of ostensibly was supposed to be kind of an opening shot to figuring out how the Republicans could sort of reform and sort of decolonize higher education in their favor. And it didn't happen, of course, right? Like Columbia ended up becoming kind of known as a protest liberal school, right? Like you saw waves and waves and waves of protest over the years that the university kind of now talks about in glowing terms. Like I actually heard this, I was talking to this one Jewish student, part of the encampment, who told me, someday maybe our photos will be on the wall next to the anti-Vietnam protesters. Like, disagree about whether or not that's going to be the case, but like that is, I think they very much see themselves as fitting into that tradition of the school. So it's not a break for them; it's a continuation. But at the same time, in America in particular, you now have a political party that is kind of openly embracing authoritarian tactics. And if we've had examples from Hungary, we have examples from Poland where higher education does become a target for right-wing populists, and if they can co-opt that effectively, like that to me is the big scary thing on the horizon. I don't know that just this kind of one happening, these weeks of happenings are really going to be much of a massive culture shift or a change, but I do think the threat of kind of political extremism is way more kind of worrying on the horizon.
It sounds like we're going to have schools that are very activist centered, and we're going to have schools where it's you just go and get an education and go and learn. And that's going to be the future landscape, is what type of protesting are you going to go to, meaning what flavor of it? Are you going to a hard right-wing school? Because I see no reason why some of these right-wing classical universities, right, that they're trying to institute are not going to become hotbeds of activism in the other direction. And what flavor of activism? Or do you not want to go to an activist education and just go and get an education? And there's eventually going to be a self-sorting that's going to happen in there. And I actually don't like that view of the future, but whatever.
I think that's the same as it ever was, right? Like you and I both went to Concordia. I didn't graduate. You did.
Barely.
Concordia... Concordia has been a hotbed of left-wing activism for ages, right? Like, and there's still the John Molson School of Business with a bunch of students who go to school in suits and who have zero interest in the protest culture of the school.
I just remember seeing students that would take one course per semester just so that they could have time to protest and be an activist. And I was like,
I think we're thinking of the same people.
Yeah. What was the purpose? I don't know. But anyways, how then do we de-escalate, right? If we're talking, we are the Jewish Canadian podcast. We are out there talking to Jewish Canadians who are getting heated and pushing back just as much as we've been talking about for the past, 45 minutes, whatever it is, 40 minutes. How do we de-escalate and do it in a way that feels responsible, but also feels like we're genuinely de-escalating?
There's this really great quote from, of all people, William F. Buckley Jr., who is not a guy who I would normally quote very often. But after the 68 election, 66, whatever, when his guy loses, Barry Goldwater, he actually kind of doesn't bemoan it. He actually, and this is a time of enormous tension and unrest in America and polarization. He says, we should embrace it. He says tensions are factors for freedom. And I really like that quote a lot, because I think it should kind of govern how we go forward on this. And it's something I again heard from these students at Columbia. Sometimes feeling uncomfortable and feeling angry is the perfect time to lean in and keep going at it, right? I think the more everyone decides to disengage and kind of live their political lives through sniping on Twitter, and I do not target that at anybody, we're all guilty of it. I think that the more we decide to kind of decamp and separate ourselves, the less you get those tensions that eventually enable freedom, right? Like, I think the only way, listen, we believe that some of these students are anti-Semites. I agree. How do you convince them to not be? Because people are not born anti-Semites. People become anti-Semites. And if people become anti-Semites, that means they can become non-anti-Semites again, right? So how do you do that? You do have to have a conversation. They won't just get bonked on the head by an apple someday and figure it out, right? Like, you need to figure out a way to bring their humanity back and to figure out a way to channel not necessarily convince them to go and support the war tomorrow, but to figure out how to support, let's say, the Palestinian state they believe in, while also believing in Israel's right to exist and also believing that Jews are not their enemies, right? Like, I don't think that is such a crazy idea. I mean, this is literally the idea that governed our society for the last 20th century and enabled, if not a total purging, at least a massive decline in the prevalence of anti-Semitism in our institutions and our politics, right? Like, we've done this before. It's not so bizarre to think we can do it again. And I think this is true for homophobia, right? Like, I spend a lot of time covering LGBTQ issues. I think this is true for racism, Islamophobia, whatever, right? Like, you don't fight these things by pulling back. You fight these things by kind of confronting them head on. And I think if you write people off, that's exactly where things become a problem. And listen, like, anti-Semitism is also a massive problem on the right. And I listen to people like Mike Johnson bemoan it on the left and not in his own camp. Like, it's going to require us holding everyone accountable for this. And I do not think it is such a naive idea that this is feasible.
Yeah, I think we also agree to all of this, but I think we also have to have hard conversations internally about what we're doing that are, that is only fueling this fire. I was at services over Passover, and I'm listening to this guy next to me talk about what's going on his kid's campus at UIC, University of Illinois in Chicago. And this person was sitting there going on and on about how difficult it is for his kid, who wrote letters to the student paper and has written, feels under attack and all that. And then all of a sudden they're like, there's, oh yes, a lot of nods of approval. And then somebody brings up this talking point. Did anybody see the color of the tents that are in these encampments? Have you heard this one? They're like, all the same color. They're all the same color. They're all paid for by the same person. Oh, nice. There's big money that is paying for these protests.
That's not a Jewish conspiracy.
Well, no,
that
hold
is
on.
More widespread.
Sure, but who's paying for Hillel? Who's paying for all these Israeli flags? You think these students are going and shelling out $10 every time they want to have an Israeli flag on campus? They're not. We are guilty of the same thing, and I don't think that it's guilt. I think that that's what it is sometimes, is you have fairly wealthy organizations that are out there helping students be activists, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to be aware of that and recognize that whatever we think the other side is doing, we're doing the same thing. That's a tough conversation we have to have internally.
And the problem with that idea is that if you sort of offshore that responsibility, if you convince yourself that these students only believe what they believe because they're getting money from Qatar or Egypt or whatever, if you convince yourself that, it's dark money somewhere that's the real problem, then you don't have to confront the fact that it's people in your society, people you live with, who you need to talk to, right? Like, and I think that's part of the problem with that kind of rhetoric. And it's also, it's also, I think, really easy to, again, keep living in these kind of this soundbite from Twitter world, right? And not sort of realize that it's a lot more complicated than that. Like, there was this one, actually, there was a statement, I think, from Northeastern. They put in a statement calling on the encampment to disperse, I think, justifying using cops. And they said, we've heard chants of kill the Jews, and that has kind of pushed us to act. Well, a reporter on the scene actually kind of followed up and said, oh, I know who you're talking about. It was a counter-protester who showed up to heckle them, waving an Israeli flag, and started saying it sarcastically, right? So I think sometimes we get really ensconced in the anger and the frustration and the immediate sort of reaction, and don't really take the time. Well,
that was a terrible instance. I have heard of exactly one thing of that nature, so I don't want to over.
I don't know. I'm not
because I think that when I see this very, very publicized, not by you specifically, but just in general. It gives the impression that half of the go back to Poland is some sort of canard, and I don't think that's quite
exactly. It gets weaponized by both sides. It goes back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to one last thing, if I may, from me, which is just I agree about the very online people being polarized, but a lot of this is happening offline in the world of actual people walking around, putting up flyers, choosing which things to pin onto themselves or drape on themselves or whatever, and having actual physical in-person interactions. I don't want to I think social media and all of this can make it hard to understand what it's actually like on the ground somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think the polarization is I don't want to romanticize students, and I don't want to romanticize the touching of grass, because I think it's nice to not be online all the time, but people can be pretty polarized and hateful offline.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, listen, let's say go to this encampment at Columbia. Students there were pretty welcoming, pretty happy to chat. You go to some others and you've seen videos of like you mentioned, protesters saying oh, you're Israeli, you can't come in, right? I don't expect anyone to go and sit and have a pleasant conversation with somebody who says, oh, you're Israeli, get out of here, right? But I think the reality is 8 out of 10, maybe. Let's say it's 8 out of 10. If you can have a conversation with 8 out of 10 people, whether that's online or in person, actually having that conversation and actually having a productive conversation where you don't walk away agreeing, but at least you walk away feeling like you didn't wind up screaming at each other. That feels like a good thing. I'll give you a little example. So I was covering this counter protest, and at one point the counter protest kind of just bumps into a counter protest. So you have the let's say the pro-Israeli side and the pro-Palestinian side, and this one group that gets into an argument with this one guy. And it's a really funny thing because they're all kind of screaming at each other what they think the other side believes. It's a lot of oh, you're fine with them killing children. Oh, you're fine with October 7th. And at one point, this guy just goes, they yell at him, oh, you must love Hamas. And the guy goes, no, I don't love Hamas. Screw Hamas. I destroy Hamas. I want Hamas gone. I want them. What are you talking about? And then everyone sort of goes, oh. And then they kind of go back to arguing in a minute. But there's this exact one moment where I saw everyone go, oh, maybe we're
closer than we thought. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Justin, where can people find your writing and your listenings and your various outputs?
Yeah. So my Substack is on bugeyed.shameless.com. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I still post links and stuff. But I'm on Blue Sky if anyone's over there. Otherwise, you can find me at justinling.ca if you want to send me maybe a slightly frustrated email, by all means.
Sure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so
please
much.
Come back anytime. And for those of you who don't write a letter to him or write a letter to him, CC it to us as well. We'd love to hear what you thought. bonjour@thecjn.ca. Justin Ling, thanks for coming on Bonjour High.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get to nachas. Phoebe, do you have any nachas?
I do. So I'm going to have to recommend, this is going to seem a little bit ridiculous, but it's a New York Times Wirecutter article. So these are you familiar, Avi, with what Wirecutter is? Okay.
I buy once a week, at least I'm on Wirecutter. It's consumer reports for millennials.
Exactly. So I don't know why I was looking at it, probably because some latkes broke our very old food processor. I was just looking at Wirecutter, and there was this article by Sabine Heinlein called "I Wanted to Love Dyson's New $1,200 robot vacuum, but our $130 budget pick cleans my home better." And you think, well, that's kind of boring, but it's all about her house and the pet rabbit and other pets and the rabbit poop and the rabbit food and the rabbit hair that's all over her place. And then there's pictures of it. And it's just extremely I don't know whether it's inadvertently funny or exactly if it's meant to be funny, but I just became captivated by this video that's captioned The 360 Viz Nav woke up my rabbit, Pushkin, but gracefully avoided him. And it's just like this. I don't know why this is so funny to me. It's just like all about these robot vacuums. And I just found this fascinating, especially like the fact that the New York Times is publishing these competing piles. So there's these two pictures that are plates that contain rice that she had spread out, hay, rabbit fur, rabbit food, rabbit poop in different amounts. And you're like comparing this. And, you know, it's important to read the breaking news. It's important to read the lifestyle news. And then there's whatever category this is, I think is probably the most important of all.
Absolutely.
Avi, what have you got?
So we had a very small Seders this year. It was just the nuclear family, just the five of us. We realized that it's hard to have lots of Seder guests in the suburbs because everybody who moves here is the type of person to have either a group of guests that they're hosting or a Seder that they've been going to for many, many years. And we live in a split level, which meant that it was very hard to hide the afikoman because anybody sitting at the head of the table can see pretty much most vantage points to the rest of the house. And so my wife came home with this idea spurred on from somebody else that she had spoken to, and I want to make this a really fun, widespread practice. Instead of hiding the afikoman somewhere in the house, we had to hide the afikoman somewhere in history. Right.
Wow.
In Jewish history. So we would think of the place and then we can only answer yes or no. And then whoever found the afikoman, with this various guessing game would get to have won the afikoman, So like I hid it in the Cairo Geniza, right? In, that repository of documents that was hidden for thousands of years, for 1,000 years or so. My daughter, of course, because she listens to Bonjour Chai regularly, hid it in Hitler's butt. Yeah. There were other much very equally funny and interesting and part of Jewish history places where the afikoman was hidden. But I think that that's a great idea if you don't have lots of great, meaningful or good hiding places or you don't know your house well enough to hide them. Go hide it somewhere in Jewish history and get everybody else to guess for it. That was a really fun, nachasi sort of thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And then your robot vacuum cleaner won't be treated to any surprises months later.
Exactly. Surprise matzah crumbs. Exactly.
Mm-hmm,
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Great episode. Love chatting with you. I missed last week. I missed talking to you last week. And
yes, it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same. Glad to be back.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending May 3rd, Shabbat Parashat Acharei Mot. The show is produced by Michael Freeman and edited by Zach Kaufman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways that we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.